We're going to bring you today's perspective, and we're taking you today to the vast green carpet of the Amazon rainforest to meet an indigenous people whose lives, though, are under threat. I'm talking about the Yanomami people, a group of around 35,000 who live in several hundred villages, separate villages on the border between Venezuela and Brazil. But how are their lives under threat? Well, the main reason is gold mining, hundreds of illegal mines. The miners want the Yanomami people gone, and federal police have even opened an investigation of possible genocide linked to the abuse of the Yanomami and their resources. Well, joining us now is Fiona Watson. She's Director of Research and Advocacy at Survival International. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme. I'd like to start off just by putting this a little bit into context. I mean, tell us first of all who these people are and how long their traditions have been there in this area of the planet.
Yeah, well, the Yanomami is a relatively isolated indigenous people living in the Amazon rainforest, and they've lived there for thousands of years. They're totally self-sufficient, living off the forest. They hunt, they fish, and they grow a huge variety of vegetables and fruits in their gardens. So they are, like most indigenous peoples, amongst the best conservationists of the Amazon rainforest, and performing, as they would say, a very valuable task, keeping the forest standing in the fight against climate change.
So tell us about the crimes that are being committed against them then.
Yeah, the situation is absolutely catastrophic, and this really happened under the watch of former President Bolsonaro in Brazil when he took office in 2019. And thousands and thousands of illegal gold miners have poured into the territory. Being a recognised indigenous territory, it is protected, so this is completely illegal. And they have wrought absolute devastation on the Yanomami. They're poisoning the rivers with mercury. They use the mercury to separate the gold, which they're mining. They've cut down thousands of hectares of forest. And I think the effect socially on the Yanomami has been terrible. There's a lot of reports of sexual abuse and rape of Yanomami women and young teenage girls. And the other key thing that the miners are responsible for is they've brought in diseases and are spreading diseases like malaria. And under the pandemic, they were spreading COVID. So we've seen the results now. Just to give you one figure, in the last 4 years, 570 Yanomami children under the age of 5 have died from malnutrition. You know, this is a people who theoretically should be and are self-sufficient, but it means that when Yanomami parents can't fish and hunt because they're sick with malaria, they can't feed their families. So this is, if you think the population of 30,000 on the Brazil side, 570 children dying is a huge percentage.
So do you think it's a deliberate targeting of the Yanomami, or is it basically an after effect of what the miners are trying to do?
I think it's deliberate. I mean, there were a number of miners in the territory before Bolsonaro took office, just over 4 years ago. But under his watch, the numbers increased, and so did the violence. We saw criminal gangs coming in, which had never been seen before, threatening and persecuting communities. And Bolsonaro actively encouraged gold mining there, even though it's against the law. And he's always been pro-mining, and he had the support of a lot of local politicians who've got their sort of fingers in the till and are some of the drivers, the masterminds, if you like, behind the illegal gold mining. So I think this has very much been stimulated by Bolsonaro, who, in fact, when he was a federal deputy in the 90s in Brazil, was always opposed to the recognition of the Yanomami territory. He's always had it in for the Yanomami. He wants them finished, wants them wiped out so that territory can be exploited for economic gain.
Of course, Jair Bolsonaro. Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, of course, Jair Bolsonaro is no longer there. We now have Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in power in Brazil. Has that made any difference? Has that made it any better?
Well, I think it's very encouraging that Lula, within the first 3 weeks of taking office, went up to the state where Roraima, where many Yanomami live. He met with sick Yanomami who were in an indigenous hospital just outside the capital. He listened to them. He saw with his own eyes, and I think he was clearly very moved and also incredibly disturbed. So his government have hit the ground running. They've got emergency health teams in there because the health system had broken down under Bolsonaro. They are trying to resolve the situation, but it's not an easy task. I mean, we're talking about a very remote area, about the size of Portugal, with a very difficult access, and the amount of damage the gold miners have done, you're not going to solve overnight. I think the other key question is, the political will is there now, but Lula is facing many challenges in Brazil, and I know the Yanomami and Survival and other organisations fear that once the spotlight turns away in a few months from this terrible crisis, that things might start to slip. And the other key point is they really need to get in place a proper long-term protection programme. I mean, there's no point in getting out the miners if they reinvade, as they have done so often in the past. And that also requires political will and funding.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly expensive. And as you say, the will has to be there as well. I mean, do you think that is there? Or if it's not going to be there to the extent that it's needed, what else can be done to help these people?
Well, I think the will is there, and the fact that there are Indigenous people, there's this new Ministry of Indigenous Peoples who are definitely standing up, obviously, and rooting for Indigenous peoples. It's headed up by an Indigenous woman. I think the international community is very much watching the case. We've heard that the UN Special Rapporteur for the prevention of the crime of genocide is going down to investigate the genocide charges against Bolsonaro. And obviously the Yanomami themselves, they have formed a number of organisations. They're extremely active and robust. So I think civil society, both in Brazil and internationally, is definitely going to do all they can to keep this issue alive until it's really resolved.
And as you said there, it's also about making sure that those people who have been responsible are brought to justice so that it just doesn't happen again.
Yes, and that's also very challenging, because there's a whole system has been set up over the years where you have powerful businessmen, some local politicians, and now criminal gangs and drug traffickers. There's a whole scenario of violent crime operating in this area. So rooting out and bringing these people to justice is fundamental, actually, because it will show people that if they try and reinvade in the future, there will be consequences. And so I think the whole justice system has to be seen to be functioning. And then there's the other point about the illegal gold supply chains. And in a sense, that's an international issue, because all sorts of countries, the UK, France, Canada, India, the UAE are importing gold from Brazil. And I think the onus has to also be on the importing countries and the whole gold trade to clean up the supply chains so that they can ensure that so-called blood gold or conflict gold, coming at the cost of the Yanomami's lives and other Indigenous peoples around the world, is not being bought by the public.
Fiona Watson, thanks very much for talking to us on the programme today. That's Fiona Watson, who's Director of Research and Advocacy at Survival International. Thank you.
Thank you.